welcome to week 7 of government. This is going to be my favorite week because we're talking about all my favorite people. I feel like I know these people. I've studied them for so long, for so many years, and they're just great. Most of them are just great men of God. Even the ones that aren't great men of God, like Benjamin Franklin, still said very godly things and had a moral standard when it came to making laws and our Constitution and everything. It's really funny. We talk about how he's one of the founding fathers that's the least godly, but really, if you look at his writings, you go, even if he didn't always practice everything, at least he thought certain things and he knew what he wanted for the nation. So I'm really a big believer in Konos. My kids have learned a lot through it. It's the units they remember, and this is the definition of courage I got from Konos, which I love. Doing what is right, even if it is dangerous and even if I am afraid. Right now in Houston, Texas, yes, Houston, Texas, the city council has asked 5 of the big ministers there, big churches, to submit their sermons on certain subjects, and they want to approve their sermons. Can you guys believe that? In Houston, Texas, we have a First Amendment right to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble. That is not allowed in the Constitution. If we just willingly turn them over and go with it, just like we do sometimes with the Supreme Court, then that's going to be the end of it. It is our Christian duty as Christians to stand up and say this is not correct. Because now, if you speak as a Christian, if you quote the Bible, if you talk about godly things, it's called hate speech. It's really incredible. So courage, doing what is right, even if it is dangerous, and even if I am afraid. You guys are all going to have times in your life where you're going to have an opportunity to do just that. It won't be maybe on this scale of the American Revolution, but maybe it will be. And, that's when your character is really found out. All right, this is Samuel Adams. Can you guys see him? And Samuel Adams is one of the key people in the American Revolution. He is a cousin to John Adams. We've learned a lot about John Adams, and then about John Quincy Adams we've learned a lot. But Samuel Adams, matter of fact, King George, they have a picture of King George too. King George called the American Revolution Mr. Adams's War. And the shot heard around the world, one of the first skirmishes that we had, King George just said, bring me Samuel Adams and bring me John Hancock's head on a platter. And he wanted to squash any talk of rebellion right then and there. So he wanted Samuel Adams' head. All right, so one of the things, of course, George Washington, very key at the beginning. There were 4 people really known at the beginning as founders of our country, and only 2 of them you're even going to recognize. And for many, many years, they were known as the founders. The founders of the Constitution and the original forefathers. And now it's so weird, is now it's known as James Madison. And we all think, and how the writing started to change in the early 1900s, that they picked James Madison, who, by the way, submitted so many suggestions for the Constitution. And it was either 40 or 60, I have it in my notes, we'll get to it, were kicked out. Like, nope, don't like that idea, don't like that idea, don't like that idea. Why in the world is he called the founder, or the writer of the Constitution, or like the original guy of the Constitution? No, he wasn't even known for that back then. So we're going to talk about all that. I'm telling you, they're rewriting history. It's the same thing as with Paul Revere, knowing William Dawes was really the one. People just change history, and if they say it often enough, separation of church and state, separation of church and state, separation of church and state. If they say it long enough, and they don't teach people in school, and they're not saying the right thing, people will believe it. And see, people are gullible. And I heard a lady say this week, she said, will the Constitution keep your rights safe? And she's a lawyer. And the answer is no, the Constitution will not keep your rights safe. It's a piece of paper with a writing on it. It won't keep your rights safe. You have to know your rights, and you have to stand up and say, this is wrong. We have to fight against tyranny. It was expected. That's why we have the right to bear arms. It was expected that they would do that. That we would do that. That we would care enough about our freedom to do that, not take it. All right, Samuel Adams. We're going to talk about him first because he was awesome. I know, I'm a little biased. Now, my favorite guy of all that we're going to talk about is Francis Marion. Little tiny guy with a limp, the swamp fox. He's, I love him too. Anyway, Samuel Adams is the one that really, he was old when he signed the Declaration of Independence. He was 80 years old. and he was the originator. He was kind of did a whisper campaign. He was always talking to people about separating from King George, and he kind of saw things down the road. If you've ever taken my psychology class, he would definitely be called a sanguine. He sees things down the road, but not necessarily takes care of details right now. And he's a classic sanguine in that he would be considered ADD, ADHD now, which I don't believe in. I think it's a personality type because there's one in every family. It's like usually there's a perfectionist and there's a peaceful and in every family. So we take the ADD people and the ADHD people of both, I'm considered, and we drug them. And then they can't be big picture thinkers. And maybe it's because these are the people that see down the road and they warn us and they just kind of see things. But sometimes they don't take care of details. So they tend to procrastinate and they drive past exits and they, they're late showing up places and they're not always the best groomed because we like comfort and all that kind of stuff. Maybe not the best test takers, but you know what? They're very smart and usually have a very high IQ. So I didn't mean to go in all that, but I'm sure, like I know my name, Samuel Adams was a sanguine, big picture thinker, and so many of our forefathers are. And it makes me wonder if they had drugs back then, if they had drugged these boys into submission so they were like zombies. All right, so Samuel Adams, he was born in Boston, Massachusetts, 1722. And he graduated at 14 and went to Harvard. And he gave a very impassioned speech when he graduated from Harvard. So before I talk about that, his dad had a big problem with Governor Hutchinson, who was ruling Boston right then, with an iron fist for King George, okay? He just had a problem with him. They would seize ships, like John Hancock's ship, and then they would split the bounty with the people that seized the ship and the judge. They would just seize the bounty for themselves. So there was no rule. They didn't need a search warrant to go in, thus the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. They didn't need any of that. They could just take our stuff at will. So really it was like we weren't really like citizens. We really didn't have the rights of Englishmen like they said we did, because they wouldn't do that in England, but they did that here while saying we had the rights. He was a Puritan, so he's a plain dresser, cared little for money, and his wife came to him when they got married with a big dowry, and he blew it. He inherited a store, and he kind of blew all that money and became a tax collector, and he would fall for every sob story, and and so he wasn't collecting taxes, and he was just one of those guys that, they said his whole family would have starved had it not been for the people, but the people loved him. And matter of fact, when he first got sent to the Continental Congress, the town got together and bought him a suit because he just looks so pitiful. If you ever seen people and it looks like they just balled up their clothes and then put them on, that was him. When he went to get his law degree, which his family didn't think was very respectable, they wanted him to work, so he was a banker for a while. A sanguine that's not good with money was a banker. Anyway, side note. So when he got his law degree, he got it in 6 weeks. He studied all the law books, unheard of, and he showed up and he had all rumpled, and they were like, I don't know. But when he started to speak and and you had to take a test to pass the bar, they heard him and they said he's so impassioned and so smart, and so they gave him his law degree after only studying for 6 weeks. It's kind of amazing. This is something that he did when he was in Harvard. He entered Harvard when he was 14 years old. And he studied an English philosopher called John Locke. And you're going to hear a lot about John Locke, and we'll be lapbooking him next week. So if you're in the mood, put him in. And this is what John Locke said. See if this sounds familiar to you. All men were politically equal. All men had three basic rights: right of life, liberty, and property. People should resist bad government, and the government had no right to tax people without their consent. Now, the thing about this is a guy in England is writing these things, a philosopher, and the people in the colonies are reading an Englishman who wrote these things, and they're adopting his ways. So it's really an Englishman who inspired the American Revolution. Funny, but true. All right, and I told you he became a lawyer, and he was offered positions by royal officials that would make him a lot of money. Because, a lot of times that happens even in today's society. They try to take smart men and men that are kind of stirring up things, and they try to, hey, come on over here. I'll pay you a lot of money. But he declined all that. He spent much time talking politics to people, and one of the things he does, he was very crafty and wily, and he would send letters to like papers and all these people and different outlets, and then he would sign different names, so all different newspapers and stuff, and then he would sign different names every time so that people would think that all these people are trying to stir up a revolution, but really it was just him writing all these names. Anyway, it was funny. He wanted people to think that all of Boston wanted independence. In 1764, he went into politics 6 times. I just want you to listen to the information I'm giving you guys, and then big picture, and then just write down the things you think are important, okay? He was very involved in the Boston Massacre, and we're going to be talking about the Boston Massacre, and he's the one that had Paul Revere create an engraving that made it look like a massacre and distributed it. It was really propaganda. It really wasn't a massacre, and we're going to talk about that in detail because it's one of those things. But remember, we were talking about this last week. If it's called a Boston Massacre, then what do you think? It was a massacre! But it really wasn't. It really wasn't the soldiers' fault. He forms a club at the beginning, which kind of morphed into a committee of correspondence, which meant they had the Secret Sons of Liberty that met, and they would kind of met. They would have a medallion that would go under their shirt, and it was very hush-hush, a secret society. And when they would meet, they had these committees of correspondence that would go tell everybody what was happening. So they would meet, they found out what was happening, they had eyes and ears out, and then they would dispatch Paul Revere or William Dawes or whoever, and they would go tell the neighboring cities and the neighboring colonies what was going on, or towns and colonies what was going on. And those were called the committees of correspondence. I know that's kind of a weird name for that, but Paul Revere was part of it. William Dawes was part of it. There was many people in the committees of correspondence. And we know Paul Revere, of course, did not make it all the way. What he's best known for, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, it was William Dawes that made it. And there's a recent protest. They were protesting a recent decision that Governor Hutchinson in Boston made, that now the King of England was going to directly pay the judges in cases, and that the judges were going to be bound to them. And we talked about that. It's listed in the Declaration of Independence. It used to be the Colonial Assembly that would pay the judges and pay salaries of the royal governor, so that, you know, he was serving the people because he was supposed to be a governor of English citizens in Boston. But all of a sudden, no, the king was paying all that. So that's why all this stuff started happening. And he believed that this measure was Britain's way of controlling government and judges. And all of a sudden about 100 more committees were started all over, and people wanted to know what was going on. And those were the rumblings in the very beginning, before a revolution. They were doing all the things we talked about, quartering troops, and our people were being killed, and mock trials were being held so that nobody was put to justice. They would kidnap our people and send them overseas for trial on pretended offenses. He's the one that organized the Boston Tea Party, which really was just the straw that broke the camel's back. It was their way of protesting. Like, if we're unhappy about something, it's your way of protesting, like a sit-in or whatever. It wasn't... We learned that the Boston Tea Party was this great big thing, which it was, but it was really protesting the fact that we could only sell to England and we couldn't buy from other people, and then they could pay us what it's worth. And it was this whole monopoly they had to limit us from making money, and then all the money we did make they would take from us. But it was on top of everything else. Our religion was getting taken away from us where we couldn't assemble. The king was about to establish churches here and standing armies and all the things that were going on. He is the one, several times, the First and Second Continental Congress, he spoke for independence. I told you the colonists it had to buy him clothes because he looked so raggedy. He signed the Declaration of Independence, and he was very, very instrumental in really leading the freedom charge. So he and John Hancock are who King George wanted their heads to, like, squash the revolution. And so the king knew this is Mr. Adams's war. Isn't that funny that the king went over in England, but he knew it was Samuel Adams's war. And I don't know if I mentioned this, that he was the cousin to John Adams. So I don't know if I mentioned that. John Adams, and of course, John Adams' son is John Quincy Adams. All right, so that's all for Samuel Adams. I keep looking at my time because my time is gone. So there was another thing that happened, that was happening, that was also creating all of these stirrings and rumblings, and we're going to talk about that next. And it's called Common Sense by Thomas Paine.